The bells rang differently in the year 1351, their iron tongues swinging through air that felt emptier than it had before, their sound carrying farther across fields where fewer ears remained to hear them. In the towns and villages scattered across the fractured map of Europe, those who had survived the great pestilence emerged from their shuttered houses like creatures stepping into unfamiliar light, blinking at a world that had been fundamentally and irreversibly transformed. The dead outnumbered the living in the graveyards, and in some places, the living themselves seemed like ghosts, haunted by memories of the millions who had vanished in the span of mere years. But what those survivors could not yet know as they stood amid the ruins of the world they had once inhabited was that they were not witnessing an ending but a beginning, that from the ashes of the greatest catastrophe medieval civilization had ever known, a new Europe would rise, one that would barely resemble the rigid hierarchical world that had existed before the plague ships arrived in Sicilian harbors in that fateful autumn of 1347. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The transformation began not with grand proclamations or royal decrees, but in the quiet, desperate negotiations that took place in manor houses and market squares across the continent. In England, a peasant named Thomas stood before his lord in the spring of 1352, his cap twisted in his work-roughened hands, and spoke words that would have been unthinkable just 5 years earlier. He wanted wages, not merely the customary gifts of grain and the right to work his small plot of land, but actual silver pennies, counted out and placed in his palm each week. His lord, a man who had inherited vast estates but now found himself with endless acres and almost no one to work them, felt the foundations of his world shifting beneath his feet. Half the villages on his lands stood empty. The fields that remained unplowed were already reverting to wilderness, brambles and young trees, reclaiming what had been carefully cultivated for centuries. In the manors beyond his own, he knew, other lords faced the same impossible arithmetic. Too much land, too few hands, and those hands now knowing their worth. This scene, repeated in countless variations across Europe, marked the beginning of what historians would later recognize as one of the most profound economic and social revolutions in human history. The Black Death had killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, a catastrophe so vast that its numbers still strain comprehension. Entire families vanished, villages were abandoned, cathedrals stood half-built, their construction abandoned when the stonemasons died and no apprentices remained to learn the trade. The survivors inherited a world of abundance, more goods, more land, more resources per person than had existed in living memory. For centuries, Europe had been locked in a Malthusian trap, where population growth constantly pressed against the limits of available resources, keeping the vast majority of people in grinding poverty. Now, suddenly and terribly, that trap had been shattered. The immediate aftermath of the plague had been chaos. In the cities, bodies had piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. The chronicler Jean de Venette described how in Paris, the corpses were laid in layers in vast pits, with just enough earth between them to preserve decency until the pits themselves overflowed. In rural areas, whole villages had succumbed to the disease in a matter of weeks. A traveler in 1350 might walk for miles through the English countryside and see only abandoned cottages, their thatched roofs already beginning to sag their gardens, overgrown, their doors hanging open to reveal empty rooms where families had once gathered around fires on winter nights. The plague had struck with such speed and such comprehensive devastation that it left the survivors in a state of profound shock, unable to fully process what had occurred. But as the months turned into years and it became clear that the pestilence, while it might return in smaller waves, had spent its initial fury, the survivors began to take stock of their changed circumstances. What they discovered transformed everything. The peasants who remained found themselves in sudden and unprecedented demand. For centuries, the feudal system had bound them to the land, requiring them to work their lord's fields in exchange for protection and the right to farm small plots for themselves. They had no freedom to leave, no ability to negotiate, no leverage whatsoever in a world where labor was abundant and land was scarce. Now, overnight, that equation had reversed. Land was abundant, labor was scarce, and the peasants, for the first time in generations, held power. The lords and landowners, desperate to get their fields planted and their harvests brought in, began offering incentives that would have seemed fantastical in the old world. They reduced labor requirements, they offered better land. Most revolutionary of all, they offered wages. The practice of paying peasants in coin for their work, once rare and limited to specialized tasks, began to spread. A peasant who felt his lord was not offering enough could now simply walk to the next village where a more desperate landlord might offer better terms. The bonds that had held medieval society together for centuries were dissolving, not through revolution or warfare, but through the simple mechanism of supply and demand. The authorities recognized the danger immediately. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from seeking better opportunities elsewhere. The law declared that all able-bodied persons under 60 who did not have independent means must work and must accept employment at the wages that had been customary before the pestilence. It forbade workers from leaving their home parishes to seek higher wages. It threatened imprisonment for those who refused to labor at the old rates. Similar laws appeared across Europe, in France, in Castile, in the German principalities. Everywhere, the ruling classes attempted to use the force of law to restore the old order and prevent their peasants from exploiting the new scarcity of labor. But laws written in manor houses and royal courts could not overcome the basic reality of the post-plague economy. The Statute of Labourers, like its equivalents elsewhere, proved almost impossible to enforce. When a lord had crops rotting in the fields and no workers to harvest them, he would pay whatever was necessary, regardless of what the law said. When a skilled artisan could name his price in a world where trained workers were desperately scarce, no statute could prevent him from doing so. The court records from the 1350s and 1360s are filled with prosecutions under the labor laws, evidence not of their success, but of their failure. For every worker punished for demanding excessive wages, dozens more successfully negotiated better terms. The legal system creaked and strained under the weight of trying to hold back economic forces it could not control. The rise in wages was dramatic and sustained. In England, a thatcher who might have earned 2 pence a day before the plague could now command 4 or even 5 pence. A skilled mason saw his daily wage double. Agricultural laborers, once the poorest of the poor, working for little more than their food and a place to sleep, now earned cash wages that allowed them to purchase goods in the market. The purchasing power of common people, which had been declining for decades before the plague as population growth outstripped resources, suddenly and dramatically increased. By the 1370s, English workers were earning roughly twice what they had been paid in the 1340s, while the price of grain, the staple food of the poor, had actually fallen due to reduced demand from the diminished population. This wage revolution rippled through every aspect of society. Peasants who had once lived at the edge of starvation now had surplus income. They bought better clothes. They purchased meat and fish, luxuries that had been rare in their parents' time. They replaced their wooden dishes with pottery, their crude furniture with better-made pieces. Archaeological excavations of peasant houses from the late 14th century reveal a material culture far richer than what existed before the plague. The diet of common people improved dramatically. Skeletal remains from this period show evidence of better nutrition, greater height, and reduced signs of the diseases associated with poor diet and crowding. The aristocracy watched these changes with growing alarm. The natural order of things as they understood it was being inverted. Peasants were living like townsmen. Townsmen were dressing like merchants. Merchants were aping the manners of the gentry. The social hierarchy that had seemed as eternal and unchangeable as the movement of the stars was revealed to be contingent, subject to alteration by something as mundane as economics. Sumptuary laws began to appear across Europe. legal attempts to enforce through dress codes the social distinctions that were eroding in practice. In England, a statute of 1363 declared exactly what sort of cloth and fur each rank of society was permitted to wear. Peasants were forbidden from wearing cloth costing more than 2 shillings per yard. Merchants could not dress like knights. Knights could not dress like barons. The proliferation of such laws is itself evidence of their futility. People would not have needed to be forbidden from dressing above their station if they had not been doing so with increasing frequency. In the cities and towns, the changes were equally profound. Urban centers had been hit particularly hard by the plague, their dense populations providing ideal conditions for the disease to spread. Some cities lost more than half their inhabitants, but those who survived found themselves in a world of unprecedented opportunity. The guilds, which had carefully controlled entry into trades to limit competition and maintain standards, suddenly faced a desperate shortage of skilled workers. The 7-year apprenticeships that had been standard began to shorten. Guilds that had once admitted only the sons of masters now accepted outsiders. Women, who had been largely excluded from many trades, found new opportunities as the desperate need for labor trumped traditional prejudices. In Florence, one of the great commercial centers of medieval Europe, a young man named Antonio found himself a master cloth worker at the age of 23, a status that might have taken him until his 30s to achieve in the old world. The Florentine wool industry, which had been the foundation of the city's wealth, had lost huge numbers of workers to the plague. The great workshops that had once employed hundreds now struggled to find dozens. Antonio's master, himself risen to his position earlier than would have been possible before the pestilence, offered terms that would have scandalized the guild in 1340. Higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions, even a share in the profits if Antonio could recruit other skilled workers to the shop. This pattern repeated across Europe's urban landscape. In the great Flemish cloth towns, Ghent, Bruges, Ypres, wages for weavers and fullers increased substantially. In the German cities, artisans found themselves able to negotiate for better terms with the merchant oligarchs who controlled urban trade. In Paris, the various craft guilds saw their journeymen demanding and receiving higher compensation. The balance of power between capital and labor, which had favored capital overwhelmingly in the crowded world before the plague, shifted toward labor in the emptier world that followed. The shortage of labor affected not just wages but also technology and methods of production. When workers had been cheap and abundant, there had been little incentive to develop labor-saving devices or more efficient techniques. Why invest in expensive machinery when human hands could do the work for pennies? But in the post-plague economy, the calculation changed. Labor was expensive. Capital was relatively cheap. The survivors had inherited the accumulated wealth of the dead. Suddenly, innovations that might have languished became attractive. In agriculture, this shift manifested in the gradual conversion of arable land to pasture. Grain farming was labor-intensive, requiring many hands for plowing, planting, weeding, and harvesting. Sheep farming, by contrast, required relatively few workers. A shepherd or two could manage large flocks. With grain prices low due to reduced demand and labor costs high, many landlords found it more profitable to convert their fields to pasture. In England, this process, which would eventually transform much of the countryside, began in earnest in the decades after the Black Death. The wool trade, already important before the plague, became even more central to the English economy. Similar shifts occurred elsewhere. Landowners moving away from labor-intensive crops toward products that could be managed with smaller workforces. In manufacturing, the high cost of labor encouraged investment in tools and machinery. Watermills, which had existed for centuries but had seen limited application beyond grinding grain, began to be adapted for new purposes. In metalworking, trip hammers powered by water wheels allowed a single worker to accomplish what might have taken several men with hand tools. In the cloth industry, the centuries-old technology of the horizontal treadmill loom, which could be operated by one person rather than the two required for the older vertical loom, saw wider adoption. These were not dramatic technological revolutions. The medieval economy lacked the scientific foundation for the kind of rapid innovation that would characterize later periods, but they represented a real shift in how production was organized. The economic changes were accompanied by shifts in the structure of landholding and agricultural organization. Before the plague, the classic manorial system had dominated much of rural Europe, particularly in England and France. Under this system, the lord's estate or domain was worked by the labor services of the peasants who held their own small plots. The peasants were tied to the land through serfdom, legally bound to remain on the manor and prohibited from leaving without permission. They owed the lord a portion of their own harvest, as well as a set number of days working in the lord's fields. This system, which had been the foundation of rural life for centuries, depended on a plentiful supply of bound labor. The plague shattered this arrangement. With so many peasants dead, the labor services owed by survivors became insufficient to maintain the domain lands. Lords faced a choice. They could attempt to enforce stricter control over their remaining serfs, demanding more work from fewer people, or they could adapt to the new reality. Those who chose the first path often found themselves facing resistance, desertion, and in some cases, outright revolt. Those who chose the second path began to rent out their domain lands to peasants in exchange for cash payments, a system that required far less direct supervision and could function with a smaller labor force. This process of commutation, the replacement of labor services with money rents, accelerated dramatically in the late 14th century. By 1400, in many parts of England, the classic manorial system had largely disappeared, replaced by a landscape of tenant farmers paying cash rents for their land. The peasants themselves benefited enormously from this change. As rent-paying tenants rather than serfs owing labor service, they had far more control over their own time. They could work their holdings as they saw fit, sell their surplus in the market, and even in many cases accumulate savings and purchase additional land. The most successful peasants, those with the largest holdings and the best land, began to emerge as a rural middle class, employing wage laborers to work holdings far larger than a single family could manage. The status of serfs improved dramatically across Europe in the century after the plague. In England, serfdom didn't vanish overnight. Legal unfreedom persisted in some areas into the 15th century, but it declined steadily as lords found it more practical to rent land for cash than to try to enforce labor services. In France, where the plague's devastation had been combined with the ongoing destruction of the 100 Years' War, the reduction in serfdom was even more pronounced. In Eastern Europe, paradoxically, the opposite occurred. The labor shortage led to an intensification of serfdom as lords used their political power to prevent peasants from leaving, beginning the process that would create the harsh estate agriculture of later centuries. But in Western Europe, the general trend was toward greater freedom and greater prosperity for the surviving peasantry. The experience of living through the plague had also left deep psychological and cultural marks that influenced how survivors approached life in its aftermath. The sudden and arbitrary nature of death during the pestilence, the way it had struck down the righteous and the sinful, the young and the old, the rich and the poor with equal fury, had shaken faith in the old certainties. The mortality rate among the clergy had been particularly high. Priests and monks who had stayed to minister to the sick had died in disproportionate numbers. Their sacrifice had been noted, but so too had the failure of prayer and penance to halt the disease. When bishops had organized processions and called for public acts of devotion, the plague had not abated. When priests had administered last rites and offered absolution, it had made no difference to the death toll. This experience produced a complex religious response. Some people turned toward even more intense piety, convinced that the plague had been divine punishment for sin, and that only greater devotion could prevent its return. Others became more skeptical of religious authority and more focused on direct personal religious experience rather than the mediation of the institutional church. The decades after the plague saw a flourishing of mystical religion, of lay religious movements, of direct appeals to scripture rather than to tradition. In England, John Wycliffe began challenging church doctrine and practice in the 1370s, arguing that scripture, rather than the Pope, should be the foundation of faith. His ideas, condemned as heretical by the authorities, nevertheless found a receptive audience among people whose experience of the plague years had left them questioning traditional religious certainties. The church itself, weakened by the loss of so many of its most dedicated members, and facing a population that had seen its apparent powerlessness in the face of catastrophe, struggled to maintain its authority. The quality of the clergy declined as the church, desperate to replace its losses, ordained men with less training and less dedication than would have been required before. The pre-plague church had been able to be selective, choosing only the best candidates for ordination. The post-plague church often had to accept whoever was willing to serve. Contemporary chroniclers complained about ignorant priests who barely understood the Latin of the Mass, about corrupt clergy who sold church offices, about prelates more interested in enriching themselves than in shepherding their flocks. Yet despite these problems, or perhaps because of them, popular religious sentiment remained intense. The late 14th and early 15th centuries saw an explosion of religious art, literature, and architecture, funded by the new wealth of both merchants and prosperous peasants. Churches were rebuilt and expanded, chapels were endowed. Books of hours, personal prayer books that had once been the luxury of the very wealthy, began to be produced for a wider market of prosperous townspeople and successful farmers. The intense awareness of mortality that the plague had created did not fade quickly. In art, the theme of the dance of death, skeletal figures leading people of all ranks to the grave, became popular. Memorial brasses and tombs emphasized the transience of earthly life and the equality of all before death. This preoccupation with mortality coexisted somewhat paradoxically with a new embrace of worldly pleasures among those who had survived. The literature of the late 14th century often reflects a tension between religious devotion and secular enjoyment, between awareness of death and delight in life. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the plague's first wave, frames its collection of often bawdy tales, with a group of young people fleeing Florence to escape the pestilence. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, composed in the 1380s and 1390s, presents a cross-section of English society on pilgrimage, but many of the tales celebrate earthly love, clever trickery, and human foibles rather than spiritual devotion. This was not a rejection of religion, but a more complex engagement with it, one that acknowledged human weakness and worldly pleasure as part of the human condition rather than something to be entirely suppressed. The prosperity of the post-plague decades extended to diet and living conditions in ways that had profound effects on health and well-being. Before the plague, the diet of most people in medieval Europe had been heavily dependent on grain. Bread, porridge, and gruel made from wheat, barley, rye, or oats formed the bulk of what common people ate. Meat was a luxury, usually consumed only on feast days. Vegetables were more common but still secondary to grain. Protein sources were limited, and many people subsisted on diets that were barely adequate in calories and deficient in essential nutrients. After the plague, this changed dramatically. With fewer mouths to feed, grain prices fell. Meat and fish became more affordable. The expansion of pasture land increased the availability of animal products. By the 1370s and 1380s, consumption of meat per capita in England was higher than it would be again until the 20th century. Workers could afford to eat meat several times a week. Butter, cheese, and eggs became regular parts of the diet rather than occasional treats. The archaeological record shows this dietary improvement in the physical remains of people who lived through these decades. They were taller, their bones stronger, their teeth in better condition than those of previous generations. Housing also improved substantially. Before the plague, many peasant dwellings had been crude structures, single-room cottages with earthen floors, no chimneys, just a hole in the roof to let smoke escape, and minimal furniture. After the plague, with more resources available and higher incomes, peasants began to invest in better housing. Chimneys became more common, allowing for proper hearths rather than open fires. Houses expanded to multiple rooms, with separate spaces for sleeping, cooking, and storage. Windows, once rare in peasant homes, became standard. Furniture proliferated. Tables, chairs, beds with mattresses rather than simple straw pallets. These improvements in living conditions had real effects on health and comfort, making homes warmer, drier, and less prone to the spread of disease. The towns and cities of Europe underwent their own transformations in the post-plague decades. Urban populations, which had been devastated by the pestilence, recovered slowly, but the cities that re-emerged were different from those that had existed before. With property values depressed and space available, urban housing improved. The dark, overcrowded tenements that had characterized pre-plague cities became less common. Sanitation improved, partly because there were fewer people producing waste, and partly because urban authorities, convinced that filth had contributed to the plague, invested in better waste disposal and cleaner water supplies. Streets were widened. Public spaces were cleared of encroachments. Building regulations were enforced more strictly. The urban economy diversified and specialized. Before the plague, most cities had economies based on a relatively narrow range of activities: cloth production in Florence, metalworking in Nuremberg, trade in Venice. In the post-plague period, cities developed more varied economic bases. New luxury trades emerged to serve the increased wealth of survivors. Goldsmiths, jewelers, bookbinders, painters, and other artisans producing high-quality goods found a ready market among both the old aristocracy and the newly prosperous middle classes. The expansion of trade, stimulated by higher per capita incomes, created opportunities for merchants and the growth of financial services. The late 14th century saw the proliferation of banking, credit instruments, insurance, and other financial innovations that would lay the groundwork for the commercial revolution of the following centuries. Education expanded significantly in the century after the plague, driven partly by the need to replace the large numbers of educated people who had died, and partly by the increased wealth that made education affordable for a broader segment of society. Before the plague, literacy had been largely confined to the clergy and a small number of merchants and nobles. Universities existed but were small and primarily focused on training priests and lawyers. Grammar schools, where boys learned Latin and the rudiments of learning, were scattered and expensive. After the plague, this began to change. New universities were founded across Europe, in Prague, Vienna, Heidelberg, and dozens of other cities. Existing universities expanded. The number of students attending university probably declined immediately after the plague, but then recovered and eventually exceeded pre-plague levels. More significantly, the social composition of university students broadened. The sons of prosperous peasants and successful artisans, families that would never have dreamed of sending a child to university in the old world, now had the resources and the motivation to do so. Education became a path to advancement, a way for families that had prospered in the post-plague economy to secure their gains and improve their social status. Grammar schools multiplied, particularly in England and the German lands. Wealthy merchants and successful guildsmen endowed schools in their towns, both as acts of piety and as practical investments in creating an educated workforce. The rise of schools teaching in the vernacular, in English, French, German, Italian, rather than exclusively in Latin, made education accessible to a broader group of students, including girls from wealthy families who had previously been almost entirely excluded from formal learning. The expansion of literacy, still limited to a minority of the population, but a much larger minority than before, had profound effects on culture, commerce, and eventually politics. The rise in literacy both drove and was driven by the expansion of vernacular literature. Before the plague, most writing had been in Latin, the language of the church and of learning. Works in the vernacular existed, but were often considered inferior, appropriate for entertainment, but not for serious intellectual work. In the century after the plague, this changed dramatically. Dante's Divine Comedy, written in Italian in the early 14th century, had shown that vernacular literature could achieve the same heights as classical Latin. Petrarch and Boccaccio, both of whom lived through the plague, continued to develop Italian as a literary language. In England, the late 14th century saw an explosion of writing in English. Chaucer's works, written in the 1380s and 1390s, demonstrated that English could be used for sophisticated poetry and storytelling. William Langland's Piers Plowman, a complex allegorical poem about the state of English society, reached a wide audience despite or because of its challenging content. John Gower wrote substantial works in both English and French. This flowering of English literature was both cause and effect of increasing literacy and of a growing sense that English, rather than Latin or French, was the appropriate language for literature and learning. Similar developments occurred across Europe. In France, Christine de Pizan, a woman who supported herself through writing, something almost unthinkable before the plague, produced works in French on subjects ranging from military strategy to the education of women. In the German lands, mystics like Heinrich Seuss wrote in German rather than Latin, seeking to reach a broader audience of lay readers. In Castile, Alfonso Dica had already promoted writing in Castilian in the 13th century, but the trend accelerated in the 14th and 15th centuries. The expansion of vernacular literature created a common culture that transcended the boundaries between clerical and lay society, between the educated elite and the broader population. The Black Death's impact on artistic and architectural production was complex and varied by region and time. The immediate effect was devastation. The loss of masters and the disruption of workshops halted work on major projects. Cathedrals under construction when the plague struck sometimes remained unfinished for decades. The carefully preserved knowledge of master craftsmen, passed down through generations of apprentices, was disrupted when whole workshops died. Some techniques were lost entirely, requiring later generations to rediscover them. Yet the century after the plague also saw remarkable artistic achievement. The prosperity of survivors, the accumulation of wealth by successful merchants and artisans, the desire of the newly wealthy to display their status, all created demand for art and architecture. In Italy, the late 14th and early 15th centuries saw the early development of what would become the Renaissance. Artists like Giotto, who had died just before the plague, left successors who continued to develop more naturalistic styles of painting and sculpture. Architects began experimenting with forms and proportions that broke with medieval conventions. The wealth of Italian city-states, particularly Florence, funded ambitious building projects and artistic patronage. In Northern Europe, the late Gothic style reached new heights of elaboration in this century after the plague. Churches featured increasingly complex vaulting, enormous windows filled with stained glass and intricate stone carving. Civic buildings, town halls, guild halls, market buildings were constructed with a grandeur that reflected the wealth and pride of urban communities. The late 14th and 15th centuries saw the construction of some of the most magnificent town halls in Europe, in Brussels, in Bruges, in Siena. Buildings that were not defensive structures like castles or sacred spaces like churches, but celebrations of urban commercial success. The increased wealth of the post-plague period also funded the production of illuminated manuscripts on an unprecedented scale. Books of hours, psalters, and other devotional texts were produced in workshops in Paris, Bruges, and other cities for a market that now extended well beyond the nobility and high clergy. The quality of these manuscripts was often extraordinary: richly colored miniature paintings, elaborate borders, expensive pigments, and fine calligraphy. The most successful artists, like the Limbourg brothers who created the Très Riche Heure for the Duke of Berry, commanded high prices and enjoyed high status. The social and economic changes of the post-plague century inevitably produced tensions and conflicts. The rising expectations of peasants and urban workers clashed with the determination of traditional elites to maintain their privileges and authority. The result was a series of popular revolts that shook Europe in the late 14th century. These uprisings, while ultimately suppressed, revealed the depth of social change and the inability of the old order to simply reimpose itself by force. In France, the Jacquerie of 1358 saw peasants rise against the nobility in the countryside around Paris. The revolt was sparked by the demands of nobles for increased payments and labor services during a period when the ongoing war with England had already devastated much of the countryside. The peasants, calling themselves the Jacques, a derogatory name applied to them by the nobility, attacked castles and killed nobles with shocking violence. The revolt was crushed within a few weeks, with nobility slaughtering the rebels with equal savagery. But it demonstrated the anger simmering in the countryside and the willingness of peasants to resist noble authority. In Florence, The Ciompi Revolt of 1378 saw the city's wool workers, the lowest rank of urban laborers, rise against both the merchant oligarchy and the established guilds. The Ciompi demanded the right to form their own guild, better wages, and a voice in city government. For a brief period, they actually succeeded, with a government dominated by the lower guilds controlling Florence. The experiment lasted only a few months before being overthrown by a coalition of wealthy merchants and established guilds, but it showed that even the poorest urban workers could organize and challenge existing power structures. The most significant revolt came in England in 1381. The Peasants' Revolt, or Wat Tyler's Rebellion, saw tens of thousands of peasants and urban workers march on London, demanding the end of serfdom, the reduction of taxes, and the punishment of corrupt officials. The rebels, led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by the radical preaching of John Ball, briefly held London and met with the young King Richard II. The king made promises of reform, but once the rebels had dispersed, the promises were broken and the leaders hunted down and executed. Yet the revolt had lasting effects. It demonstrated the impossibility of returning to the pre-plague status quo and accelerated the decline of serfdom in England. These revolts shared common features. They emerged in regions where the economic changes of the post-plague period had been most pronounced. They were led not by the poorest and most desperate, but by relatively prosperous peasants and artisans who had tasted improvement and wanted more. They articulated demands for greater freedom, better treatment, and more just governance. They were ultimately defeated militarily, but they succeeded in demonstrating that the old social order could not be maintained without accommodation to new realities. The gradual decline of feudalism and the rise of more market-oriented economic relationships had profound political implications. The feudal system had been built on personal relationships, the bond between lord and vassal, the obligation of protection in exchange for service. As these relationships were replaced by cash payments and market transactions, the basis of political authority shifted. Kings who had once relied on feudal levies to raise armies increasingly turned to paid soldiers. Nobles, who had once justified their privileges by their military service, found those justifications weakening as professional soldiers proved more effective than feudal knights. The cost of government and warfare increased substantially in the post-plague period. Paying soldiers required cash. Maintaining administrative systems required trained clerks and lawyers. Funding these expenses required taxation, and taxation required the consent, or at least the acquiescence, of those being taxed. The 14th and 15th centuries saw the rise or expansion of representative institutions across Europe, parliaments, estates, diets, that gave propertied subjects a voice in government in exchange for their financial support. These bodies, while dominated by elites, created precedents and institutional structures that would eventually limit royal power and create space for more participatory governance. In England, Parliament became more firmly established as an essential part of government. The House of Commons, representing towns and counties rather than just the nobility and clergy, gained the exclusive right to initiate taxation. In France, the Estates General met more frequently during the crises of the 100 Years' War. Though it never achieved the same permanent role as the English Parliament, in the Iberian kingdoms, the Cortes of Castile, Aragon, and other regions gained increased importance. In the Holy Roman Empire, the various territorial diets became more significant as the emperor's power continued to weaken. These developments were uneven and often reversed, but the general trend was toward more complex, more institutionalized systems of governance that could not simply impose their will but had to negotiate with significant social groups. The relationship between the church and society also underwent significant transformation in the century after the plague. The Great Schism, which split the church between rival popes in Rome and Avignon from 1378 to 1417, further weakened papal authority that had already been damaged by the church's apparent powerlessness during the plague. The spectacle of rival popes excommunicating each other and competing for the loyalty of European rulers made it difficult to maintain the church's claims to universal authority and spiritual supremacy. The critique of the church intensified during this period. Wycliffe in England argued that a sinful priest could not validly perform the sacraments, and that scripture, not tradition or papal authority, should be the basis of Christian belief. His followers, called Lollards, distributed translations of the Bible in English and challenged various church doctrines and practices. In Bohemia, Jan Hus, influenced by Wycliffe's ideas, led a reform movement that criticized clerical corruption and demanded that lay people receive communion in both bread and wine, a privilege that had been reserved for priests. Hus was burned as a heretic in 1415, but his execution triggered the Hussite Wars, a series of conflicts that demonstrated the depth of dissatisfaction with the established church. These challenges to church authority were not yet the Protestant Reformation. They lacked the political support and the technological tools that would make the 16th century break with Rome successful, but they established precedents and articulated critiques that would be taken up by later reformers. They also reflected a broader shift in religious sensibility, a move toward more personal, more emotional, more direct religious experience. The late medieval church increasingly emphasized the humanity of Christ, the suffering of the crucifixion, the sorrows of Mary. This focus on the emotional and personal aspects of faith reflected the desires of lay people for a religion that spoke to their experiences and feelings. The economic prosperity of the post-plague period was not evenly distributed or permanent. The late 14th century was in many ways a golden age for common people in Western Europe, a period of high wages, cheap food, and improving living standards. But this prosperity depended on the specific conditions created by the plague: abundant land and scarce labor. As population gradually recovered in the 15th century, some of these advantages eroded. Wages began to fall, though they remained well above pre-plague levels. Land became less abundant. The economic conditions that had given peasants and workers such leverage began to shift. Moreover, the prosperity was concentrated in Western Europe, particularly in England, France, and the Low Countries. In Southern Europe, particularly in Italy, the economic picture was more complex. The Italian city-states had built their wealth on long-distance trade and banking, industries less directly affected by population levels. While Italian cities also experienced the wage increases and social tensions of the post-plague period, their economic trajectory was different from that of the agricultural economies of the North. In Eastern Europe, as previously mentioned, the labor shortage led not to greater freedom, but to increased serfdom, as lords used political power to prevent peasants from leaving their estates. The 15th century saw a gradual transition away from the immediate post-plague situation. Population recovery was slow and uneven, set back by recurring outbreaks of plague and other diseases. The Black Death returned in smaller waves in 1361 to 1362, 1369, and at irregular intervals thereafter. These later outbreaks were less deadly than the initial pandemic, but they prevented rapid population recovery and kept demographic pressure low. It was not until the late 15th or early 16th century that population levels in most of Europe returned to where they had been before the Black Death. This slow recovery meant that many of the social and economic changes initiated by the plague had time to become embedded in European society. The decline of serfdom in Western Europe, the rise of wage labor, the expansion of market relationships, the increasing importance of monetary transactions. All these changes, which might have been temporary responses to crisis, instead became permanent features of the social and economic landscape. By the time population recovered to pre-plague levels, Europe was a fundamentally different place than it had been in 1347. The technological and organizational changes that emerged in response to the labor shortage also proved lasting. The expansion of pastoral farming, the development of labor-saving tools and techniques, the reorganization of agricultural production, these adaptations to the post-plague economy created efficiencies that persisted. When population recovered and labor became more abundant again, these efficiencies meant that the economy could support more people at higher standards of living than had been possible in the 13th century. The Malthusian trap had not been escaped permanently, but it had been loosened. The long-term cultural impact of the plague years is harder to measure, but no less significant. The experience of living through the greatest catastrophe in European history left marks on the collective psyche that lasted for generations. The awareness of death, the sense of life's fragility, the understanding that disaster could strike without warning, these became permanent features of late medieval and early modern culture. The memento mori, the reminder of death, became a common theme in art, literature, and daily life. Tombs and monuments emphasized the transience of earthly glory. Popular sayings and proverbs reminded people that death could come at any moment. Yet this awareness of mortality did not lead to pessimism or withdrawal from life. Instead, it seemed to intensify engagement with the world. If life was short and death certain, then it became all the more important to make the most of the time available. The late 14th and 15th centuries, despite or perhaps because of the shadow of the plague, saw remarkable creativity, energy, and innovation. This was not a civilization in decline, but one experiencing a profound transformation. The intellectual life of post-plague Europe gradually moved in directions that would eventually lead to the Renaissance and the early modern period. The increased availability of books, the expansion of literacy, the growth of universities, and the rise of educated laypeople all contributed to a broadening and deepening of intellectual culture. Ancient texts that had been preserved in monasteries but little studied began to receive more attention. The search for classical manuscripts intensified, driven partly by the realization that knowledge could be lost, as so much had been lost during the plague, and partly by a growing appreciation for the achievements of classical civilization. Petrarch, who had survived the plague, devoted much of his life to searching for lost classical texts and promoting the study of ancient literature. His efforts inspired others. By the early 15th century, Italian humanists were actively seeking out Greek and Roman manuscripts, learning ancient languages, and attempting to recover the full intellectual heritage of classical antiquity. This movement, which would flower into the Renaissance, was made possible in part by the economic and social changes that followed the plague. The prosperous merchants of Italian city-states had the wealth to patronize scholars and artists. The expansion of education had created a class of people capable of appreciating and continuing humanist scholarship. The loosening of old certainties had created space for new ideas. The emphasis on classical learning brought with it a different view of human potential and human nature than had dominated medieval thought. Medieval Christianity had emphasized human sinfulness and the need for divine grace. The Church had been the mediator between humanity and God, the dispenser of salvation. The classical texts that humanists studied offered a different vision, one in which human reason and human virtue could achieve great things, in which the glory of human achievement was something to be celebrated rather than suspected. This classical humanism did not reject Christianity. Most humanists remained devout believers, but it complicated the medieval worldview and opened space for a more human-centered philosophy. The technological developments of the 15th century, particularly the invention of printing with movable type by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, were both products of and contributors to the transformations that had begun with the plague. Printing was not a response to the plague itself, but it emerged from the world the plague had helped create. A world with higher literacy, greater demand for books, and the technical skills and capital to develop and refine new technologies. The printing press would, over the following decades, transform European culture by making books cheap and abundant, facilitating the spread of ideas, and enabling the rapid dissemination of new learning. The political map of Europe also underwent significant changes in the century after the plague, though the connections to the pandemic were often indirect. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which had begun in 1337, continued until 1453. Shaped by but not caused by the plague. The war's outcome, the eventual French victory and the expulsion of the English from almost all their continental possessions, helped consolidate national identity in both kingdoms. In England, the experience of the war and the social changes of the post-plague period contributed to political instability that eventually erupted in the Wars of the Roses. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Christian kingdoms continued their centuries-long reconquista against Muslim Granada, finally completing the process in 1492. The social and economic changes of the post-plague period affected this process, making resources available for continued military campaigns and creating the conditions for the eventual unification of Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella. In Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire continued to fragment, with territorial princes gaining effective independence while maintaining nominal allegiance to the emperor. In Eastern Europe, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland united in 1386, creating a vast state that would dominate the region for centuries. The Italian city-states, which had been among the wealthiest and most powerful political entities in medieval Europe, underwent significant changes in the post-plague period. The republican governments that had characterized many cities in the 13th and early 14th centuries increasingly gave way to rule by single families or individuals. Milan came under the control of the Visconti and later Sforza families. Florence, after a period of republican government, fell under the domination of the Medici family. Venice maintained its republican institutions, but became increasingly oligarchic. These changes reflected in part the social tensions created by the economic transformations of the post-plague period and the desire of wealthy elites to secure their power against challenges from below. The marriage patterns and family structures of Europeans also changed in the wake of the plague. The sudden availability of land and resources allowed young people to marry earlier than had been possible in the crowded pre-plague world. Before the plague, the age of first marriage had been rising, particularly in areas where population pressure was intense. Young men often had to wait until their 20s or even 30s until they inherited land or established themselves in a trade well enough to support a family. Young women similarly married later. The plague reversed this trend. With property available and jobs plentiful, young people could establish households earlier. However, this trend did not produce a sustained increase in population growth because of the recurring outbreaks of plague and other diseases. The populations that had survived the initial pandemic seemed to be more vulnerable to disease generally, perhaps because the trauma and disruption had weakened resistance, perhaps because of other environmental factors. Plague returned regularly, though never with the devastating mortality of the first outbreak. Other diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, also took their toll. The overall effect was to keep population levels depressed for more than a century after the initial pandemic. The relationship between population levels and economic well-being became a subject of debate among modern historians. The golden age of labor interpretation, which emphasizes the improved living standards of common people in the post-plague period, has been challenged by historians who point to the disruption, violence, and uncertainty of the era. There is no doubt that wages rose and material conditions improved for many people. But there is also no doubt that the plague years were traumatic, that the social order was violently disrupted, that war, rebellion, and disorder were common. Whether the post-plague century should be seen primarily as a period of opportunity or primarily as a period of crisis depends partly on which aspects of the era one emphasizes and partly on whose perspective one adopts. For the peasants and urban workers who survived, the material improvements were real and significant. They ate better, lived better, had more freedom, and enjoyed more opportunities than their grandparents had. For the traditional elites, the nobility, the higher clergy, the established urban oligarchies, the period was one of challenge and threat, as their traditional privileges and authority were questioned and eroded. For merchants and entrepreneurs, the period offered opportunities for accumulation and advancement. For women, the effects were mixed. The labor shortage opened some opportunities, but the patriarchal structures of society remained largely intact. The position of women in post-plague society deserves particular attention, as the labor shortage affected them differently than men. In some ways, women gained new opportunities. The shortage of workers meant that women could enter trades and occupations that had been closed to them before. Widows, who had always had more economic independence than married women, found themselves in particularly advantageous positions, often inheriting their husbands' businesses and managing them successfully. In some cities, women appear in guild records in occupations that had been exclusively male before the plague. However, these gains were limited and often temporary. As population recovered and labor became less scarce, women were often pushed out of trades they had entered during the crisis period. The fundamental legal and social subordination of women remained largely unchanged. Women still could not hold political office, could not attend universities, and had limited legal rights. The property they brought to marriage came under their husband's control. Their testimony in court was given less weight than that of men. The post-plague period did not bring about a revolution in gender relations, though it did create some spaces where women could exercise more economic agency than before. The Jewish communities of Europe had suffered particularly during the plague years, not just from the disease itself, but from the violence directed against them. As the plague spread, rumors circulated that Jews had caused the pestilence by poisoning wells. Despite the obvious absurdity of these accusations and the fact that Jews died of the plague at the same rate as Christians, mob violence broke out in many places. Jewish communities in the German lands were particularly hard hit, with massacres occurring in dozens of cities. Many Jews fled eastward, establishing communities in Poland and Lithuania that would become centers of Jewish life for centuries. In the post-plague period, Jewish communities slowly rebuilt, though their position remained precarious. They continued to be excluded from most occupations and confined to a limited range of economic activities, particularly money lending and trade. The prosperity of the late 14th century, while it benefited many Christians, did not extend equally to Jews, who remained subject to restrictions, special taxes, and periodic expulsions. The experience of the plague years, rather than creating sympathy or recognition of shared suffering, often intensified anti-Jewish sentiment, as Christians sought scapegoats for continued hardships. The expansion of trade in the post-plague period gradually knit Europe more closely together economically, while also extending European commercial networks beyond the continent. The Italian city-states continued to dominate Mediterranean trade, maintaining commercial relationships with the Byzantine Empire, the Muslim world, and increasingly with the emerging Ottoman Empire. The Hanseatic League, an association of trading cities in northern Europe centered on German cities like Lübeck and Hamburg, controlled much of the Baltic Sea trade and had outposts from London to Novgorod. The prosperity generated by this trade funded the artistic and cultural achievements of the late 14th and 15th centuries. The great merchant families of Florence, the Medici, the Strozzi, the Pitti, used their wealth to commission artworks and buildings that would become treasures of world culture. In Flanders, the wealth generated by the cloth trade supported artists like Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden. In Germany, the merchant cities of the Hanseatic League built magnificent churches and civic buildings. The relationship between commerce and culture, between wealth and art, became increasingly explicit. This connection between money and culture was not without its critics. Moralists condemned the luxury and ostentation of the wealthy, seeing in it a departure from Christian humility and a danger to the soul. Sumptuary laws attempted to limit displays of wealth, though with little success. Preachers railed against the sin of pride and the dangers of worldly attachment. The tension between religious ideals of poverty and humility and the actual behavior of a society growing wealthier and more materialistic would become a recurring theme in late medieval and early modern culture. The gradual economic recovery of the 15th century brought with it renewed interest in overseas exploration and expansion. The prosperity of the post-plague period had created capital that could be invested in risky ventures. The high wages that benefited workers in Europe made imported goods, particularly spices from Asia, expensive. This created an incentive to find direct routes to the source of these goods, bypassing the Italian and Muslim middlemen who controlled the existing trade routes. The Portuguese, under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator and his successors, began exploring the west coast of Africa in the 1420s, establishing trading posts and gradually working their way south. This exploration, which would eventually lead to the Portuguese reaching India in 1498 and the Spanish discovering the Americas in 1492, was not a direct result of the Black Death, but it emerged from the world the plague had helped create. A world with more capital, more technical skill, more organizational capacity, and more willingness to take risks and challenge old certainties. The age of exploration, and the colonial empires it would spawn, can be traced in part to the economic and social transformations that began in the century after the plague. The transformation of European warfare in the late 14th and 15th centuries also owed something to the changed economic and social conditions. The old feudal system of military service, never entirely effective, became increasingly obsolete. The professional soldier, fighting for wages rather than out of feudal obligation, became the norm. This change was driven partly by the practical advantages of professional armies. They were better trained, more reliable, and more effective than feudal levies. But it was also made possible by the increased monetization of the economy and the greater availability of cash to pay soldiers. The development of gunpowder weapons, which began to transform warfare in the 15th century, was likewise facilitated by the economic changes of the post-plague period. Cannon and handguns were expensive to produce and required specialized skills to manufacture and operate. The capital and technical expertise needed to develop these weapons existed in part because of the economic prosperity and increased technological sophistication of post-plague Europe. The gradual replacement of the armored knight by the gunpowder-armed infantryman symbolized the broader transformation of European society, the old aristocratic order giving way to new forms of power based on wealth and technology, rather than birth and tradition. By the end of the 15th century, Europe had been fundamentally transformed from what it had been in 1347. The social structure was less rigid, with more mobility and more opportunity for common people. The economy was more commercialized, with market relationships replacing many traditional feudal obligations. The culture was more diverse, with vernacular literature flourishing alongside Latin learning and classical texts being recovered and studied with new intensity. The political order was evolving toward more centralized states, with more complex administrative systems. The Church, while still powerful and central to European life, had seen its authority challenged and its unity fractured. These changes cannot all be attributed directly to the Black Death. Many were the result of long-term trends that predated the plague. Some would have occurred without it, though perhaps more slowly. But the plague was a catalyst, accelerating changes that might otherwise have taken centuries and making possible transformations that might never have occurred in its absence. By killing so many people so quickly, by breaking apart the old social and economic order, by creating a world where everything that had seemed permanent suddenly revealed itself as contingent, the plague opened space for new possibilities. The memory of the plague remained vivid for generations. Chronicles and histories recounted its horrors. Literature and art returned repeatedly to themes of death and mortality. The phrase, "the great mortality," or "the great pestilence," entered the common vocabulary as a reference point, a dividing line between the world before and the world after. Successive generations measured their own experiences against the stories they had heard of that terrible time when death had seemed to rule the world. Yet the terror gradually faded, incorporated into the background of medieval life alongside war, famine, and all the other dangers that had always existed. The plague became not the end of the world, but one catastrophe among many, devastating but survivable. Life went on. People married, had children, built houses, planted crops, traded goods, created art, made war, made peace, and went about the business of living. The world the plague had shattered was rebuilt, but it was rebuilt differently, shaped by the experience of catastrophe into new forms. The intellectual foundations for the Renaissance, the economic structures that would enable the commercial revolution, the social changes that would eventually erode feudalism, the political developments that would lead to the modern state. All these can be traced in part to the century after the Black Death. The plague did not cause these developments in any simple sense. History is too complex for such straightforward causation. But it created conditions in which they became possible, removing obstacles, redistributing resources, challenging old certainties, and opening minds to new possibilities. The century after the Black Death was a time of mourning and trauma, but it was also a time of opportunity and transformation. For the survivors, life went on, but it went on differently than it had before. They built a new world from the ruins of the old, a world that in some ways seems to us more recognizable, more modern than the medieval world that preceded the plague. The wages they earned, the books they read, the houses they lived in, the freedoms they enjoyed, all these were built on the tragic foundation of millions of deaths, but they were real nonetheless. In the cottages and manors of the countryside, in the workshops and markets of the towns, in the courts and universities, in the monasteries and parish churches, Europeans of the late 14th and 15th centuries navigated a world that their grandparents would have found almost incomprehensible. They lived longer, ate better, had more freedom, enjoyed more opportunities, and faced fewer restrictions than their ancestors. They also lived with the memory of catastrophe, with the knowledge that the order of things was not fixed and eternal, but could be shattered in an instant, that death could come without warning, that the world could change in ways that seemed impossible until they happened. This knowledge, born of trauma but transmuted over time into something more complex, became part of the foundation of European culture going forward. The awareness that change was possible, that the old ways were not inevitable, that individuals could shape their own destinies and societies could transform themselves. These ideas, which would eventually help create the modern world, found fertile ground in the century after the Black Death. As the 15th century drew to a close, Europe stood on the threshold of even greater changes. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and pushed European powers to seek new routes to Asian trade. The invention of the printing press was beginning to transform the spread of information. The artistic and intellectual flowering of the Italian Renaissance was reaching new heights. The Spanish kingdoms were completing their reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula and looking outward toward new horizons. Within a generation, European ships would reach the Americas, beginning a process of global expansion that would reshape the entire world. These developments of the early modern period emerged from the transformations of the late medieval period, transformations that had been catalyzed by the Black Death. The catastrophe had not only killed millions, but had also destroyed certainties, challenged hierarchies, redistributed resources, and created space for new ways of living and thinking. The Europe that embarked on its age of global expansion was a product of the century after the plague, shaped by the terrible losses and surprising opportunities of those decades. The survivors of the Black Death and their descendants had rebuilt their world, but they had rebuilt it differently. They had learned that change was possible, that suffering could be survived, that new beginnings could emerge from endings. These lessons, learned at terrible cost, became part of Europe's cultural inheritance, shaping the civilization that would eventually spread across the globe. The century after the Black Death was not just a period of recovery from catastrophe. It was a period of transformation when a new Europe was born from the ruins of the old, carrying within it the seeds of the modern world. In the quiet evenings of the late 15th century, as families gathered in cottages that were warmer and more comfortable than those their great-grandparents had known, as they ate meals that were more abundant and varied than their ancestors had enjoyed, they might have told stories of the plague years, of the great mortality that had swept away so many. Those stories, passed down through generations, preserved the memory of catastrophe. But the lives the storytellers lived, the prosperity they enjoyed, the freedoms they possessed, were themselves a different kind of story, a story of survival, adaptation, and transformation, of a world that had died and been reborn, changed forever by the experience but continuing nonetheless, carrying forward into an uncertain future the lessons and legacies of the century after the Black Death.